preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
What was it that made Andy decide to go to Mississippi back in 1964?
Well, Jerry, before I answer that question,
if you want to talk.
Before I answer that question, I think I'm going to applaud you for your sensitivity, because you didn't tell them how old I was going to be on my birthday. And I'm going to be 90.
Yay.
But I do get around, and I will say that getting from the west side, where I happen to live, to the east side is a longer trip than going to Mississippi. And I see here some of my really wonderful friends sitting in a couple of these rows here who I love very much. And it's so nice to see you, because I don't see you very often. And I want to also welcome you and all the others here. And you've done a nice job of that, Jerry, but let me just repeat that.
Go ahead.
So it's really good to see you. And your question was,
well, what made in 64, I guess it was spring of 64, that
yes.
Andy decided to go to Mississippi?
Andy was brought up in a family which, we never pushed our children to do anything. They just lived in a home and in an environment, and went to a school where they just heard a lot of talk, which they said, what's going on in the world today? And a lot of the people here remember that it was a rather difficult world to live in. A man by the name of Adolf Hitler was doing some pretty terrible, awful things, not only to Jews, but to non-Jews at that time. For any young person who was listening, they said, this is not a world that we want to be in. We want to change it, because we know that we have a future. And that's the way Andy looked at things. And he asked questions, and then, there were things that were going on in our own country that were not very easy to live with. So when he was quite young, there were a lot of kids that went out to a place called to do some training and prepare to go south. Because in our own country, voting was not an easy thing for people who were Black. And, I feel as if I'm talking to people who know all these things, and I think I am, but it's always sort of nice to refresh our memory about them, because, the world keeps going on, and things don't change as much as they ought to change. So I think it's important for us to remember that we have to keep working and doing things, and young people are very important in our lives. And while Andy is gone, there are a lot of young people who say, well, what's up? They say to their parents, and their parents really say, well, there are things that are happening in our country and in places not far from here, and we don't like something called racism. We don't like something called anti-Semitism, and we don't like the fact that we might be leaving our world to you young people. So we have to take our chances, we have to take risks, and we have to make changes, and this is how we do it. So that's the kind of thing that Andy was very conscious of. Mm-hmm. And so he took his chances. And of course, he's not here, but he has left us a legacy. And it's the legacy that I, at my age, am trying to move forward with young people. And I think we are moving forward. So that's what we have to remember. We have to remember we have to continue to move forward in every way that we can, answer questions, be supportive, and say, yes, we are taking our chances, but let's keep going.
How did you feel about him going to Mississippi? I know you probably had some concerns about that.
Sure. It was frightening. And, you don't expect the worst to happen, but I know that, it's like crossing the street. You're when you do things and you're willing to stick your foot out or your neck out, you take a chance. And if it's something you believe in, you do take that chance. And there are people in this room who have taken chances. I know that because I know some of you. And that's the way it is. And if it's worthwhile, you do it. And you're not happy about it. And as a parent, I wasn't happy, but I remember he took with him a duffel bag, and I would throw in things like bandages and iodine. I said, well, if something happened to him and he were put in a jail or something like that, at least he'd be able to take care of himself. And, like I say, as a parent, you don't expect the worst to happen. So you just do what you can.
Now, the FBI spent a lot of time at your house. Sure. The FBI spent a lot of time at your house. I understand that summer. They basically kind of set up shop in terms of, like, with the telephone. They had the telephone wired or whatever and tape recorded and all that. That had to be pretty unnerving to have to deal with that.
Yeah, it was, but we began to realize that we were dealing with something that was historic, that was important, that was going to be living history, if you will, and it was very, very difficult. And then my husband, Bob Goodman, died, and so many things happened, and I myself didn't know if I was going to be able to deal with it. And, well, it was a time that, it was just very difficult to deal with. But I thought that this was important, and it was something that was going to be a legacy. It was going to be part of history. And there were some times that, you're in a critical situation, and part of it is you use your head and you say, but it's nothing that you can use your head about because your heart is bleeding. And so there's all this conflict that you're going through. And there were times I wanted to go too. I didn't want to survive. But I knew I had to. I had to, because they were going to be, not for me, not for my friends, but for the young people. They had to know, they had to hear, they had to be able to look to somebody and say, this is living, this is history, this is something we have to know about. And so I was there.
And speaking of young people, I mean, you got a lot of letters that summer from well-wishers, I think, mainly, but obviously some other letters that maybe weren't nice. But from what you told me before, you really couldn't bring yourself to read much of that, except you got one note from a little girl. Could you talk about that?
Well, yes. As a matter of fact, I'm going to see her very soon. And her name she had a middle name, which is Goodman. She's married now, and so that's not her name anymore. But as I said, I'm going to be 90 very soon, and she's an artist, and she called me just the other day, and she said, "Carolyn, it's going to be your birthday soon, isn't it?" I said, "Yes." She said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm going to have a birthday party." She said, "Can I come?" I said, "Yes, you can come." She said, "You know, I'm married, don't you?" I said, "Yes, I know you're married, but you can come anyhow." So she said, "Well, what can I do?" I said, "What you can do is you can tell people that you're still around, that you still care, and that you wrote me a letter, and I still have that letter." And she said, "You still have that letter?" I said, "Yes, I still have that letter." And the letter she wrote me was so beautiful. And she said, "Well, if you still have it, can you read it to me?" I said, "I'll get it and I'll read it to you." And the letter was as follows. She said, "Dear Miss Goodman," she said, "I just found a little cat, and I'm going to call the cat Andy." And she said, "If that's all right with you," she said, "please, if it is, answer this letter." And she said, and she wrote on and on about how important it was. And she was going to raise money because she read her father, she was a little girl, so I think she was 10 years old. And she said her father told her that the reason that the boys were killed is that they had no radio. And she was going to raise money for radios. And she was going to put a box up in her school, and people were going to drop nickels or dimes or pennies in a box so they could have radios in the car the next time that they traveled, that kids traveled to the South, and to help people to vote. And so she closed the letter and she signed it SWAK. And she said, "I hope you know what that means." And so I'm going to see her very soon. She's now married and has 2 children of her own. I guess that's the letter you're referring to.
That's the one I was talking about. And I think that's such a sweet story. Now, obviously, news came about the station wagon being burned out pretty early on in that summer. Was President Johnson the one who called and told you that, or?
It was Johnson because Kennedy had just been assassinated.
Right.
Yes.
So he was the one who called and told you that.
Yes. And that was, all these things happened at once. And also my husband Bob Goodman had just died, and it was a terrible time. It was a decade of the 60s that was a time of survival, as I said before, that I hope nobody ever has to live through. But people were so wonderful, absolutely marvelous. You hear that people don't care about each other, but they do. People reach out in times of crisis, and that's when it matters. And he was a man who was from the South, who became president when his boss was killed, Lyndon B. Johnson, and he just couldn't do enough. He was wonderful.
Of course, while this whole summer is going on, back in Mississippi, you have people like the governor and Senator Eastland all saying, "Oh, this is all a hoax," and they really weren't killed. And of course, the truth came 44 days later, for everybody. And Talk about Andy's headstone. I think that's one of the more interesting things, and what made you decide to, what his headstone says, and what made you decide to do that.
Well, we didn't know exactly how to deal with that, but there was a great English poet by the name of, is that the one you, by the name of Stephen Spender. And we asked him if we could put the last two lines of his poem on Andy's headstone. And he said, of course. It was quite all right with him. And the last two lines says, he traveled a short while toward the sun and left the vivid air signed with his honor. And that stone is in the cemetery. And I think Betty Ann has seen that. This happens to be a person in the audience, has seen that stone. And there's a tradition among the Jews that when you go into a cemetery, you put a little pebble on a stone if you happen to know the person. And she happened to be with us, went there together one day. And that particular stone, Andy Stone, which was designed by a rather famous artist, has a lot of pebbles on it. And it's a very beautiful stone. It's quite a large one, and it's concave, and it has his hands crossed this way, and one hand coming from that way, and one hand coming from the other side, which signify Schwerner and Cheney. Mm-hmm. And I gather it's visited quite often. And curiously enough, the cemetery is fairly large, so that there are a number of different, what they call avenues, so that people can find the stones of their loved ones. And so one usually goes to the administrative office at the cemetery to find out how to get there. And it happens that this stone is on Abraham Lincoln Boulevard. It's just coincidental. Mm-hmm. So it has a lot of significance to me, of course, and to a lot of other people.
Mississippi, of course, didn't prosecute anybody for murder back in those days. And although finally there was a federal conspiracy trial in '67 where 18 men were finally went on trial. And of course, 7 were convicted and the rest of them were not. And of course, none of them ever served more than 6 years. You probably already know that. But you didn't go to the trial. Why not? Why did you?
Well, for one thing, I'm opposed to any kind of violence, and I didn't, I didn't want to be there to observe that. But I was in the courthouse later at the time that Killen was convicted of manslaughter. I tell you, it was just so difficult to look at this man. I mean, he just represented such evil to me. I was asked by the district attorney of Mississippi and the attorney general if I would mind testifying. It would be helpful. Mm-hmm. And I said that I would testify if they thought that it would be helpful. So I was there for that. Mm-hmm. So I did go, and it was, I didn't realize actually that the Klan was still around and sort of after me, you might say. So I guess I was naive about that, but I was in the court, and I did testify, and I remember I had to go to the ladies' room, and so I had this. There was some man who was driving us around, and he said, "I'll take you." I said, "No, you don't have to." He said, "Oh yes," he said, "I'm going to take you to the ladies' room." So he did, and stood outside the door, and so. As a matter of fact, he was outside our hotel. He was around everywhere we went. He drove us, he this and that and the other. So when we left, and we were on the plane coming back, I said to my son, it's a little crazy that I couldn't go anywhere without this man. He said, "Listen, do you know who this man was?" I said, "No, I have no idea. Why did he follow us around everywhere we went?" He said he happens to be an ex-FBI man, and he had a gun in his pocket. And do you know that the Klan was following you everywhere you went? So, well, it's a good thing I didn't, because I think I would have collapsed completely. But I mean, I think the whole idea of the story is that we tend to be a little bit, relaxed about all these things, and we have to be sure that we are aware that everywhere in this country, and it doesn't matter who you are, that there are these things, the racism and anti-Semitism, and it isn't only as far as being Jewish. I think it's a matter of the fact that if you're opposed to the power structure, you just have to be aware of what's happening and not be so, just be aware of it. That's the important thing, message.
Now, from what you've told me before, you didn't necessarily think this case would ever be prosecuted for murder in Mississippi, but your late husband did. Didn't he tell you at some point?
Yes, he said that he didn't know when, but he thought that, they put it off and put it off and put it off, and we didn't really know if it was going to happen. But, that basically, no matter what you may think of the power structure, so-called, I say so-called, and you know what I'm talking about. You know who I'm talking about, that this is a country of laws, mm-hmm. and that ultimately justice will be served. And I think it's happened. I mean, I think that, that justice will be served and is served, and that people who take the law into their own hands have to realize that, that they have to pay for mm-hmm. what they do. Right. And I think we've seen it happen.
To back up a little bit in time, in 1989, when the 25th anniversary which was, I think, the first time you'd ever been to Mississippi, if I remember right. Dick Malpas, who was the Secretary of State of Mississippi, who's from Philadelphia, from Neshoba County, stood up and basically apologized to all the families. And of course, that was the first time the state of Mississippi had ever apologized for anything, I think. But do you remember anything about that day? You remember that occasion? Or?
Well, he was a remarkable man. I mean, because he himself took this great risk in doing so. But that's why, what I say is, and I've said this before, that there are always, in any situation, people just fight and are willing to kill because they don't want there to be changes in the system that they live under. But they are really in the minority, actually in the minority. And there are some great people everywhere. And they also take their life in their hands. And you've done that, Jerry. And there are and I think we have to acknowledge that. And I have in New York City, I've experienced the same thing. I mean, I've tried to get on a bus sometimes, and people will, push you aside. It doesn't matter how old you are or what the situation is. There are always people that don't give a darn, and I think that you have to acknowledge that that people are the same all over. It doesn't matter whether it's in Massachusetts. It doesn't matter whether it's in New York City. It doesn't matter whether it's in Mississippi. And you have to deal with it. You don't accept it, but you have to adapt to it.
And I was also going to ask you about, there was an occasion, I think it was either in the 70s or 80s, where one of the men who was involved in the killings actually showed up on your doorstep, basically. Yeah. Talk about that.
Well, it was really quite a shock to me, and I was alone, and I didn't know what he wanted, and I said, "Why are you here?" And he looked at me and he said, "You're not going to believe this." And I said, "Well, I don't know whether to let you in or whether not to let you in." He said, "You can do what you want. If you ask me a question," he said, "I am here to apologize. I did the wrong thing." Well, I couldn't believe it. And I let him in. I said, "If you came this far to apologize, you can come into my house." But that's what I'm saying. There are all kinds of people. And when I told that to my son, he said, "Ma, you're crazy." And I said, "But David, that's how people are. You have to believe." Mm-hmm. That's what happened. Can you believe that? I bet you don't believe it, but it's true.
I mean, I think it says a lot about you that you were able to forgive him. I mean, and to accept that apology. Some of us guys probably wouldn't have been so inclined.
Well, I guess it's either that or naivete. I'm not sure which.
Well, I thought I'll tell you a little bit about kind of my adventures, if you want to call them. If you want to hear them.
Yeah.
You've heard. I'm gonna bore you because you've already heard these stories before.
Fine, but you've heard all of mine too.
But anyway, I think that God gives us children to keep us humble. I think, I know it wasn't too long ago that my son Sam, a friend of his, came over, and he asked me what I did, and I said, "Well, I write for the newspaper." And I saw Sam pull his friend back over and goes, "He doesn't write, he types." So I'm really no more than a glorified typist. I just wanted y'all to know that. I started this journey back in 1989, frankly by accident. I saw really, it's not a good movie at all and not accurate and nothing to it, but I saw Mississippi Burning, and I was frankly shocked, to be honest with you, at the things that took place in this country that, as a kid, a lot of it when I was a kid, and I had no clue and no idea that any of this had taken place, including the killings of Andy, Mickey, and James. But that affected me, and I saw the movie with two of the FBI agents who investigated that case, as well as a reporter who covered all that, and that made an effect on me. And anyway, one thing led to another, and finally, it's kind of a long story, but the short of it is I began to get copies of secret files of this commission, Segregationist Spy Commission, which existed in Mississippi. You may have read about it or may not have, but it was called the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, which was headed by no less than the governor of Mississippi. And it was basically, they infiltrated civil rights groups, they harassed people, got people fired from their jobs, passed information on to the Klan, et cetera, those kinds of things. And I actually initially wrote about this case, and then come to find out at the same time that the state of Mississippi was supposed to be prosecuting Byron D. LeBeckwith for the killing of Medgar Evers, this other arm of the state was secretly helping out the defense, trying to get him acquitted. And nobody knew that at the time. So I printed this story, and this was October 1st of 1989. As a result of that story, Myrlie Evers basically said that the case should be re-prosecuted. At the time that she said this, I have to tell you the odds were probably 1,000,000 to 1 against this case ever being re-prosecuted. There was no transcript, no murder weapon. The court files are maybe 6 or 7 or 8 pieces of paper, but nothing of any value. But Myrlie Evers believed, and she prayed, and some amazing things happened. A few months later, Jackson police are cleaning out a closet and happen to find a box that contained the crime scene photographs of the killing of Medgar Evers, including the fingerprint of Byron D. LeBeckwith lifted from the murder weapon. A couple of months after that, Myrlie Evers shared with me her copy of the transcript of the case. And a few months after that, Bobby DeLauder found the murder weapon in his father-in-law's closet. And it sounds like I'm making this up, you know. That's why I tell young reporters, you should never, why write a novel? I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It's just so incredible and fascinating. In short, all the things that had to happen happened for that case to get reopened. Have any of y'all seen the movie Ghost of Mississippi? Probably not many of you. It's a forgettable film, but anyway. But I'm the jerk of the reporter in the film, in case you ever see it. But my wife and I were fortunate enough to get to go to the premiere here in New York. It was my first time to New York, and anyway, well, I have to tell you this about the movie. The 2 questions I usually get about the film are, did you get a bunch of money, and were you portrayed accurately? And the 2 quick answers are no and no. I didn't get any money, and there's nothing that my character says on screen that I actually said in real life. So much for Hollywood. But like I said, my wife and I got to go to the premiere, and so, you know, it was somewhere around 52nd Street, somewhere in the theater over in that area. And so there are all these celebrities, Rob Reiner and Whoopi Goldberg and James Woods and all these people, Alec Baldwin. And so my wife says, okay, well, we can't talk with all these celebrities around. So if there's anything inaccurate in the movie, just press my palm. You know, it's like, okay, sure, no problem. So the movie, you know, the credits roll, the movie starts, and the screen goes dark and says, this story is true. And I'm like, but another question I always get about the movie is, was Byron D. LeBeckwith portrayed accurately? And I have to tell you, he was even worse. He's even more racist than he was portrayed in the movie. I know that's hard for you to believe, but trust me, he's just incredibly racist, the most racist person I ever spent serious time with. But I interviewed him for about 6 or 7 hours. He lived in Signal Mountain, Tennessee, which is right outside of Chattanooga. And it was starting to get dark. And, you know, Signal Mountain's a beautiful place, you know, when it's getting dark, but, you know, not if you happen to be with Byron D. LeBeckwith. So he insisted on walking me out to the car. I'm like, you know, really, that's okay. I think I can find my way. And so he walks me out anyway. And he tells me, if you write positive things about white Caucasian Christians, God will bless you. If you write negative things about white Caucasian Christians, God will punish you. If God does not punish you directly, several individuals will do it for him. So another time, Beckwith saw me in the courtroom and says, you see that boy over there? When he dies, he's going to Africa. I turned to my friend Ed and said, you know, I've always wanted to go. So, not surprisingly, Byron D. LeBeckwith was convicted of the killing of Medgar Evers in 1994 in the same courtroom he was tried in 30 years earlier, almost to the day, which is incredible symmetry, isn't it? The next case that I wrote a lot about, and I'd already been writing about, was the Vernon Dahmer case. Vernon Dahmer, you probably don't know, you may not have heard of him, but he was NAACP leader in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, which is about an hour and a half southeast of Jackson. The Klan didn't like the fact that he was allowing, this is back, I'm sure we've got a good audience here that remembers these things. That was back when he had poll taxes in Mississippi, which of course were set up to disenfranchise African Americans. Well, he was going to allow people, even though he couldn't vote himself, the circuit clerk wouldn't allow him to. He was going to let people pay their poll taxes at his little grocery store, which is on the outskirts of Hattiesburg. And so the Klan didn't like this. And so they basically attacked him and his family in the middle of the night about 2 o'clock, January 10th, 1966, really frigid morning, and launched Molotov cocktails into the house, began firing into the house. Vernon Dahmer grabbed a shotgun and ran to the front of the house, began firing back at the Klan so that his family could escape out the back. Initially, I thought he was going to be okay, but what happened were the flames seared his lungs, basically. And so he died later that day. And I can't tell you what a great family. In fact, all these families, Dr. Goodman and her family, and all the families of these people, Stan, and just, terrific folks. But anyway, fast forward to initially, right after Beckwith got indicted, the Dahmer family met with the DA, and he said, "Yeah, I'll look at it. I promise. Sure, I want to do this." And of course, that was a lie. And so it just rocked on and rocked on and rocked on. And then he left office, and there was an entirely new DA who came in, and it was like, oh, this is really not going to happen now. And so I got an opportunity to go get my master's at Ohio State. I got, scholarship thing, so I could go for free, which I'm always for that. And so I'm literally up at grad school. I get this call from this guy who, by the way, wouldn't identify himself, I might add, but he once worked for Sam Bowers. Sam Bowers was the head of the Klan in Mississippi, the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, which was responsible for not only these murders, but probably about 10 murders in Mississippi back in the 60s. And Bowers was the head of that, and he ordered, of course, the killing of Vernon Dahmer. He had been tried back in the 60s, but never been convicted. So this guy used to work for Sam Bowers. He was like an errand boy for Sam Bowers. And it turns out, the guy's name is Bob Stringer, he was a gambling addict. And so he was going through his 12-step program. Well, step 9 is to make amends for all the bad stuff you've done in the past. So he came forward. And so we met in some seedy motel room down on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. I flew back from Ohio, and it was very odd and strange. But Bob basically said that he overheard Sam Bowers give the orders to kill Vernon Dahmer. And so as a result of that, this was in 1997, spring of 97, case got reopened, and they began to pursue it in earnest. And then by fall, I was back in Mississippi, fall of 97. And it turned out that the guy who was the key witness back in these trials, that they did have a few people get convicted back in the 60s, although the governor basically commuted their sentences or let them out early or whatever, was a guy by the name of Billy Roy Pitts. And Billy Roy Pitts was involved in the killing and turned state's evidence and testified against these other guys. Well, no one knew where Billy Roy Pitts was. And I'd always been told by the previous DA that Pitts had served his time in the witness protection program. Well, I was trying to find out all the various time that all these various guys did. And so I was talking to the Bureau of Prisons and found out that there was no witness protection program at that time. So in other words, Pitts had been released, but he never served. He'd been sentenced to life in prison in Mississippi, but he had never served a day of his life sentence. It's kind of like one of those things, it's hard to imagine what happened, you know? leave it to Mississippi in those days. So I found that out. So naturally I wanted to get a hold of Pitts. And so there's an internet site, you probably know about it. It's called switchboard.com. And you can literally type in somebody's name. You don't even have to know where they live, even a state, and you can sometimes find them. Well, lo and behold, I typed in his name and it popped. I couldn't believe my good luck. And so the first 20 minutes of the conversation he and I have were like this: how'd you find me? How'd you find me? I'm like, it's on the internet. The internet, I've got an unlisted telephone number. So I did my story, and as a result of course, finding out he'd never served a day of his life sentence, the state authorities issued a warrant for his arrest. Well, he didn't take too kindly to that. He went on the lam, actually, and while he was on the lam, he sent me a little cassette tape in the mail, and on the tape he goes, "Jerry, I just thought I'd let you know you've ruined my life. But I promise if I talk to anybody, I'd talk to you. So here's this tape." And of course, he proceeds to tell me all about his involvement in killing Vernon Damer and other violence he was involved in the Klan. So he turned himself in to authorities right after that. As a result of that, of course, this set in motion the arrest of Sam Bowers. This was in May of 1998 that Bowers was arrested along with his right-hand guy, the guy by the name of Devers Nix, who was the head of, and I'm not making this up, the Klan Bureau of Investigation. So when they brought Devers Nix in, it was like the most pitiful sight you've ever seen. You know, they wheeled him in the wheelchair, you know, and he had like the big green oxygen tank and the nasal cannula. You know what I'm talking about? You know, it was like really pitiful looking. And so he's talking to the judge, and he's telling the judge, "I can't take more than a couple steps without needing oxygen, Judge." So the judge is like, "Well, I normally don't do this, but I'm going to let you out without bond." A dozen days later, we caught him on the golf course. Of course, we got pictures of him playing golf. So he ran like before and after, you know, wheelchair, golf course, you know. And so he got arrested. And so fast forward now to August of 98, Bowers went on trial. And of course, Devers Nix had been indicted as well. And he decided to testify on Bowers' behalf. Well, this is a tricky situation because he can obviously, anything he says can be used against him, you know, if and when he ever goes on trial. So anyway, so Devers shows up wearing, by the way, the same golf cap he was wearing the day he was playing golf. It was the funniest trial I ever covered, I promise. Serious matter, but funny trial. So Devers is talking to his lawyer. Now, this guy that was representing him was a guy by the name of Lawrence Arrington, who back in the 1960s was a great criminal defense lawyer. But by now, you know, he's in his 80s, you know, and so, so he's telling Devers before he gets on the witness stand, "Now, Devers, if you need to take the Fifth Amendment, I'm just going to raise my hand. I'm just going to raise my hand." And Devers like, okay. So Devers gets up, starts testifying. I looked over 5 minutes later, promise it was like this. So Devers is like, "Yeah, I was in the Klan." And then he was like, why, the Klan was a benevolent organization passing out fruit baskets to the needy at Christmas. And the jury laughed. So under cross-examination, the prosecutor got up there and said, so Mr. Nix, just how many fruit baskets did you pass out? And Devers says, sad to say, none. So not surprisingly, well, I should mention one other thing about the trial. Billy Roy Pitts testified, obviously, too. And Sam Bowers was represented by this guy by the name of Travis Buckley. You've seen the Budweiser commercial with the iguana. Yeah, he's got those iguana eyes, you know. And so, and Travis Buckley, to explain a little bit more about him, was kind of the lawyer for the Klan back in the 60s, which I guess carried the perk, if you want to call it that, of like a free membership, you know. So he was in the Klan too. So he gets up and he's cross-examining Billy Roy Pitts. There was this planning meeting that took place like a month prior to this that they decided to kill Vernon Dahmer. So he's cross-examining Pitts about this planning meeting. Now, Mr. Pitts, who all was at this planning meeting? Pitts is like, well, let's see. I was there. Sam Bowers was there. Devers Nix was there. Well, you were there. And Buckley's like, objection, Your Honor. I've covered a lot of trials. That's the first one I ever covered where a witness actually implicated the defense lawyer in the case. And not surprisingly, Bowers did get convicted in the case. And then, quite by accident, I got involved in the Birmingham case. I'm a Mississippi reporter, but the wife of Bobby Cherry, who was one of the last living suspects, I talked to him by phone before, contacted me and said her husband wanted to talk about this. So I was like, okay. So I drove down to Texas and I took him out for barbecue, and because, well, I guess that's what you take Klansmen out for. I'm not really sure, but so anyway, we talked for about 6 hours, and he's like, well, I didn't have anything to do with that church bombing. Yeah. And if any of y'all seen the documentary Spike Lee did, Four Little Girls, if you haven't, I highly recommend it. It does a good job of summing it up, which I'm really not doing here. With the 4 girls being killed in '63, blowing up the church. But anyway, so he's like, well, I didn't have anything to do with that church bombing. I left that sign shop. The sign shop's like 2.5 blocks from where the church blew up, 16th Street Baptist Church blew up. I left that sign shop at 9:45 because I had to get home and watch wrestling on television, what he was talking about. And he even pulled out the sworn affidavit from this woman. Yes, I remember that night well. We're all sitting around watching wrestling. So when I got back to the paper, I just, to me it was just pretty elementary. I talked to our librarian, Susan Garcia, and said, Susan, just check with the Birmingham News and see what was on TV that night. And so the next morning, I got an electronic message from Susan, all in capital letters. There was no wrestling. In fact, there hadn't been wrestling on for years. And it always struck me as so stupid because to me, I'm thinking to myself, the first, like if you're making a list of things to do if you're a criminal, it's like, number 1, check alibi, Seems pretty basic, doesn't it? And then it wasn't too terribly long after that. I had heard that he was involved in the beating of Fred Shuttlesworth. Now, Fred Shuttlesworth was kind of like the civil rights leader in Birmingham. And he got beaten and his house blown up and his church blown up. In fact, when he was beaten unconscious one time, he had a concussion, went to the hospital. He went back that night to a civil rights gathering and spoke. And what he told them was, well, the Lord knew I lived in a hard town, so he gave me a hard head, You got to love guys like that, don't you? But anyway, so Fred Shuttlesworth showed up with his children. This is after the Brown versus Board of Education ruling in 54. This is several years after that. He just decided one day, I'm just going to show up with my kids to enroll them. The Supreme Court said they should be able to go to public school. And so he did. And so he, and when he did, there was there a problem? Anyway, so he when he did, his white mob basically gathered and just beat him, And what I found out was there was footage of this, and I'd heard that Cherry took part in it. So I was wondering, well, I wonder if you can see Cherry in the footage. So I got, Cherry's son, I happened to know, who's a truck driver, and he came through Jackson occasionally. So I called him on the phone and said, yeah, I've got some footage. Would you mind looking at it? So he did. And he went, yep, there's Dad. He's like, yeah, you can see him pulling the brass knuckles out of his pants. We okay? All right. All right, we're okay. All right. So overcome the noise here. So not surprisingly, that footage got shown to the jury several times, and he was convicted of the church bombing in 2002. I started writing about this case in '89 and periodically wrote about it the whole 16 years. But what I found out in 1998 was that we got to go. All right.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.